Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us in the world. Thank you so much for joining Veranex today on the very important topic of leveraging your FDA clearance and approvals for successful EU MDR submissions. Our incredible team here will talk about how to bridge the gaps and maximize synergies between these submissions. So again, thank you for joining Veranex. We're very excited to have you all. My name is Christy Nakayama. I'm the Senior Vice President here at Veranex. I lead business development for our U.S. regulatory, clinical, we're a full medical device focused CRO and quality systems, international quality system standards division within Veranex. I have 15 years in the med tech sector, ranging from commercialization and business development and M&A. So just to give you a quick overview and background of Veranex. So Veranex came together through many acquisitions of companies who are long established service and consulting providers within the medtech space. So while Veranex is new, each of our acquired companies who now make up the Veranex family bring anywhere from 20 to 40 years of experience in consulting, working with notified bodies, working with regulatory authorities worldwide. So we are a product design and engineering firm. So you can bring us a napkin design and we can help you through, really conceptualization, early feedback, product testing, human factors, usability. We have a state-of-the-art preclinical lab for large animal studies. Again, we're a full med device focused CRO and support, early strategic thought partnership on the clinical strategy side as well. We provide data management and analytics services. And then what you're here for today, regulatory affairs and quality. And then last and not least, early market and commercial strategy. So really partnering with our clients on how do you go to market? How do you plan for reimbursement, pricing, coding coverage, and payment? So we're very excited to have you and for this very focused topic, as well as exploring in the future ways that Veranex can partner with you. So with that, I'm very pleased to pass it over to one of our presenters, our first presenter, Paige Sutton-Smith.
Thanks, Christy. My name is Paige Sutton-Smith. I'm a project associate with Veranex. I've been with Veranex for about 1.5 years. But I have 10 years in the medical device industry, particularly with class 2 and class 3 devices and invasive and implantable devices. I also have expertise in process validations, design, V&V, QMS deployment, and I do quite a few audits here at Veranex. I also have my RAC devices certification, and I'm a certified quality engineer. I'd like to turn it over now to my colleague, Antonia.
Thank you, Paige. My name is Antonia Klaus. I've been in the industry for about 18 years, most of those within regulatory and quality. Now, I've done a lot of regulatory strategies. I've done CE marking, submissions worldwide, and I also know some quality system management work as well. I also hold a RAC devices certification. And with that, I'd like to kick off our first part. So starting today, we'll go through first an overview of the regulatory requirements. And I wanted to just begin by giving you a brief overview of what CE marking actually is. Now, some of you might be very familiar with this before. You might already have done this previously. But if not, here's a very brief refresher. So now in Europe, medical devices are subject to Regulation EU 2017-745. It's usually called Medical Device Regulation or MDR, although the formal name is quite a bit longer. The process to CE mark is called conformity assessment. And once you've completed that conformity assessment process, you can affix the CE mark to your device and then place it on the market. Now, unlike the US or in other geographies, CE marking is a decentralized process. This means that you don't have a central regulator such as the FDA or PMDA in Japan or TGA in Australia, for example, that look at your device. Instead, you have in Europe notified bodies. Now, they are actually private companies and they have different expertise. Most devices that are going to be CE mark will require the involvement of a notified body. Another very brief item here is that devices are classified based on risk level. This is similar to the US and in many other countries. It is based on risk, where 1 is the lowest risk and 3 is the highest risk. Classification is something that's really important to know right off the bat, because different conformity assessment procedures are available depending on classification, but also on the type of device you have. The characteristics may place different demands on the conformity assessment procedure. Just a quick aside, we won't be going into detail on this, but do keep in mind that Switzerland and Great Britain are now third countries. They are no longer within the CE marking of the EU. Switzerland used to have a mutual recognition agreement which expired, and Great Britain, of course, went through Brexit, which meant separation from the EU. So do keep in mind that if you're looking at those countries, you will need to comply with separate requirements. So just a little bit of history then, transitioning from the directives, because it wasn't always a regulation. So previously, before we had the MDR, we had 2 separate directives. 9342 EEC, which was for medical devices, or which we often in short call MDD, or 9385 EEC, which was for active implantable medical devices, or AIMDD. Now, essentially, the MDR, as we have today, replaces both of those directives. Now, the date of application of the MDR was back in 2021. It was actually meant to be earlier than that. Now, the MDR was in the works for many, many years. They had a draft come out in 2012, but as it was quite a big change, it needed all the member states to agree on it. And finally, in 2017, they agreed on the MDR. It was then entered into force in 2017, and then a transition period began. Now, initially, that was meant to be for 3 years, so in 2020, but due to the pandemic, other reasons, and particularly the lack of availability of notified bodies, they had to delay it by a year. Now, the transition period is still in effect. They're still phasing it in. Largely, this is partly due to the lack of notified bodies. Essentially, there's been a very slow process in getting them to be accredited for MDR CE marking. So very briefly, now the devil is in the details. So if you need to know more about this, essentially devices which are class 1 under the MDD, for which you have an EC declaration of conformity that was drawn up prior to 2021, the date where it took effect, and where you need now a notified body, you are what is called a legacy device. Also under the legacy device category, you have devices that were higher class and had a notified body involved prior to 2021. So what this really means, and this is very brief, if you have a class 1 device, now you don't have a transition period. You have to comply with the MDR straight away. Now, the end of the transition period will depend on your classification. So if you already have a CE mark device, you need to pay attention to the dates and the details around it. Keep in mind that different conditions apply. You can't make changes, for example, to your device that are significant, because then your current CE mark will no longer be valid. Even if you can continue to have your legacy device on the market, you have to comply with legacy device requirements, which are mainly post-market surveillance requirements that are in the MDR. So just a brief overview of the regulatory process, just some critical elements to keep in mind when CE marking. Of critical importance is qualification and classification, first up. I'll go into these in more detail shortly, but I just wanted to give you an overview to start with. Once you know your classification, it is critical to identify your applicable regulatory requirements, because they are going to be your roadmap to get your CE mark and get your product to the market. Part of those requirements is going to be establishing your technical documentation and your quality management system, or if you already have these, updating them so that they comply with the MDR requirements and will get through your conformity assessment. Then you go through your conformity assessment procedure. If you have a low classification, you can do it by yourself, self-certification, but in most cases, you will need involvement of a notified body to do so. Once you've completed your conformity assessment, you can then CE mark your device, place it on the market, but no, it doesn't quite end there. You have to comply with post-market obligations to maintain your CE mark, essentially. Just a very quick overview of conformity assessment procedures. For Class 1, the lowest risk devices, provided that they are not sterile, they do not have a measuring function, and they are not reusable surgical instruments, do not require a notified body. So just Class 1 do not require a notified body. All other classes require notified body involvement, and this includes if you have Class 1, but they are sterile, have a measuring function, or are a reusable surgical instrument. The specifics of your conformity assessment procedures are found in Annexes 9, 10, and 11. They will largely depend on the class of your device and the device characteristics. For example, additional requirements apply for sterile devices, such as microbiology audits. There are several different conformity assessment procedures, again, depending on classification and device characteristics, but the most commonly used procedure, and this is true even under the MDD as well as currently under the MDR, involves assessment of your quality management system and of your technical documentation by a notified body. But do be aware, even though when you have your CE mark and you have your routine quality management system audits, you may have unannounced audits. So an overview of qualification and classification. Essentially, it is to answer the question, is it a device and which class is it in? So qualification then is the product a device, which will essentially determine if it's within the scope of the MDR. Now note here that it's not just a device that's in the scope of the MDR. There is now an annex to the MDR of devices without a medical purpose that are to be treated as devices. You can also have other types of products which are accessories to medical devices, which then place it within the scope of the MDR. Also, another thing to note, if you are in the FDA world, it's worth noting that the device definition and the accessory definition, for that matter, are different to that which is set out in the Food, Drug and Cosmetics Act. Classification then, once you've established that it is in fact a device, you are looking at classes 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. And as I mentioned briefly before, you might have subtypes of class 1 as well. They can be sterile, usually called 1S. They can have a measuring function, usually called 1M, or they can be a reusable surgical instrument. And there's a typo there, it's actually meant to be 1R. Classification is a bit different to in the US. It is rule-based. It is based on 22 separate rules, which must be each addressed in your classification. Several definitions also apply. So what you really need to do is to have a detailed document where you look at the definitions that apply to your device and really look at each rule in turn and each section of each rule to determine which ones apply and which ones do not. It can happen that a notified body does not agree with your classification. It can, in fact, be challenged several years later. So it's good to have a strong, well-reasoned document to set out why you believe that your device is a certain classification. After all, you don't really want to be doing extra things if you do have, in fact, a lower class device. So classification will determine which MDR requirements apply. And also a word of caution here, it's not unusual that you have devices that are borderline. For example, you can have devices that are borderline with IVDs or borderline with cosmetics. You can have combination products. You can have a lot of questions, and it can get asked during review of your technical documentation. What is the mechanism of action of your product? And it can be challenged if you do not have the scientific evidence to back up why you believe that your product is a device. So again, a well-reasoned background to qualification and classification is going to be invaluable. So we have a question for you. And we'll just give you some time to respond to these questions. We still have answers coming in. I'll just give it a few more minutes. And I think we're getting a fair idea of the answers. 76% of you have given the correct answer, which is in fact B, home use devices. So back to our regulatory requirements then. So this is a high-level overview of the requirements in the MDR. You need to have a quality management system, and Paige is going to go into this in more detail, but this applies for all devices, regardless of their classification. This is a little bit different to what it used to be in the MDD before. You were actually meant to have a quality management system for all devices, but it was not so clear and the requirements were not clear. Technical documentation is another requirement regardless of your classification. I'm going to go into this in slightly more detail shortly. In the MDR, you have a list of general safety and performance requirements. Now, this is a list which is meant to capture all types of devices, and I'll go into this in more detail shortly as well. But you need to go through these in detail and determine how you're going to comply with them if they apply. And if they do not apply, you have to have justification. And there are different methods of complying with the requirements. Standards tend to be the preferred method. There are also common specifications. There are very few at the moment, but you want to be sure that there are none that apply to your device. There are also guidance documents out there. Not quite as many as those of you who are familiar with the FDA are used to, but there's quite a few, and there will most certainly be some that apply to you. A requirement that perhaps is a little bit different to the US is post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. I'll briefly go into this as well. And then we have another list of various requirements in the MDR. So you have specific requirements if you're performing clinical investigations. You have requirements for unique device identification. If you are located outside of the European Union, you need an authorized representative, which is placed in a member state in the European Union. There are also requirements for other economic operators, such as distributors and importers. You need to have mechanisms for cooperating with competent authorities. Now, competent authorities are different from notified bodies. They are actually the local regulators in each country, and they can request information from you. And you also need to have a person responsible for regulatory compliance, for which there are specific requirements on background and experience, including education. An overview of technical documentation, and you will find details about this in Annex 2 and 3 of the MDR. Now, there are 7 categories here, where the first 6 are in Annex 2 and the final one is in Annex 3. Each of these contain a lot more detail than what is seen here. But first, you need to have a robust device description and specification, including variants and accessories. And this can include things like mode of action, what is the intended use, who is the user, what is the user environment, etc. Describing the device so that the reviewer essentially understands your product. There's a section on information to be supplied by the manufacturer. Now, this is your instructions for use and your labels. There's a section on design and manufacturing information. Now, this one is a section for describing your manufacturing process in some level of detail and also describing how you've developed the product, essentially the design history, an overview of that. There is a section on the general safety and performance requirements, which I'll jump into next. And then there is another section on risk analysis and risk management, where you have to go into detail about how you've addressed the risk requirements that are set out through the MDR. Product verification and validation tends to be your biggest section. That's obviously heavily influenced by the type of device you have. So things like sterilization processes, electrical safety, EMC, software, verification and validation, etc. And then you need to have a section on post-market surveillance. And even if you have a new device, which has never before been on the market, you have to have a plan for how you're going to do your post-market surveillance. And that has to be submitted to your notified body right off the bat. An overview of the general safety and performance requirements. There are three categories. These are all found in Annex 1 of the MDR. There's a set of general requirements. A common theme throughout these are risk management, and there's also a lot about performance and safety. Most of them apply to essentially all devices. Then you get into the far more detailed requirements, which are chemical, physical, and biological properties, other things such as infection and microbial contamination, construction and interaction with the environment, radiation, etc. And these are obviously not all going to apply to your device unless you have an extremely complex system. The final section is probably what looks the easiest, but it's quite lengthy, and it's a lot of detailed requirements on the information that you supply with the device. So labels and your instructions for use and what those need to contain. Now, when you do the general safety and performance requirements, I strongly recommend that you really early in your process identify which ones apply, because you do have to address the ones that do not apply with adequate justification. And for those that do apply, you need to have those methods such as standards, guidances, common specifications, etc. So you really need to build these into your design control process as early as you possibly can. Something else to note is that there are lots of elements of risk, particularly in this design and manufacture section, that you need to consider in your risk management from the beginning. So just a summary on complying with the general safety and performance requirements. Assess each one early in the process. Make sure that you have strong justifications for why those that do not apply are not adequate or appropriate for your device. For requirements that do apply, you have to have the methods of compliance. You can use standards. Some of these may be what's called harmonized with the MDR. Now, there are very few at this point in time that are harmonized, so it tends to be more popular to go with those that are state of the art, which tend to be the latest possible version. Note that common specifications may apply. These are essentially something that the Commission write to address areas for which there are no standards. So they might decide that for certain types of devices or categories, they may need to set specific requirements out. As I mentioned very briefly earlier, there are many guidance documents that will apply to you, everything from post-market surveillance to how you classify devices. And for each applicable general safety and performance requirements, you must have traceability to the exact documents that you then supply as proof of compliance. And these are going to be, of course, consistent with the other documents that you have in your technical documentation. So use a checklist and start this checklist off as early in the process as you can. We have another poll, another question, so I'll give you some time to answer these. Still have a few answers coming in. And I think it's quite clear a bit over half of you responded, but 81% of you say marketing materials, which is the correct answer. So in your regulatory requirements then, what are the potential gaps? If you already have US clearance or approval, you probably have a lot of the things that you need, but we don't want to say that everything is very easy and you can just use your FDA file, because that's not the case. The general safety and performance requirements, which I've already highlighted, are going to be the main area where you have to go back and really look carefully and look at which standards you might have to get up to speed with to comply with those. Clinical evaluation, I will also touch on very briefly. That is a fairly robust process. It's not just clinical studies. It is a more comprehensive process than that. Biological evaluation may also differ somewhat, mainly because you have to show much more clearly that you have a plan that's based on risk management, you have a report where you're really closing out the risks. So more than just the testing that you do in biocompatibility, you have to have more documentation and justification for what you've done. Risk management is going to be a little bit different. The EU has slightly stricter requirements. For example, you have to reduce all risks as far as possible, regardless of or not if they're acceptable per your criteria. Post-market surveillance, as I mentioned, I'll go into this briefly as well. And compliance with specific standards, guidance, documents, and common specifications. And something to highlight here is that there is no grandfathering. So even if you CE marked something some time ago, it doesn't matter. You have to keep up with updates to standards and guidance documents and do gap analyses and get up to speed. This is all in keeping with the state-of-the-art background to the medical device regulation. Very quickly on clinical evaluation then, it's a robust process for reviewing all clinical data. There are comprehensive guidance documents on this, which I strongly recommend that you look at. And this process involves not just looking at the studies that have been done, but also the scientific literature that relates to safety, performance, design characteristics, and intended purpose of a device. You also have to look at any other currently available treatment options for that purpose, if any, similar devices, for example, or other treatments, even if they are drugs, for example. You need to have a plan and a report, and then several other documents that might be behind these. You must perform it in a individual or team situation where you have a number of qualifications put together. You need to keep it up to date. You used to update it with post-market surveillance data. So it has to be state-of-the-art again. And also something to keep in mind, if you have a class 3 or an implantable device, you have to have a summary of safety and clinical performance, which in part summarizes your clinical evaluation, but it is to be made public. So anyone out there, including competitors, can get to it. Very briefly on benefit risk analysis and risk management, you want to reduce risk as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. So again, as far as possible might be a bit different to what you've done previously. State of the art pops up in risk management again. You want to be making sure that you're reducing your risk in line with state of the art, not just the simplest solution available. You have to reduce as far as possible risks related to ergonomic features, suggestive of usability or human factors. And the next item too, giving consideration to knowledge, experience, etc. of users, is also suggestive of usability. You have to manage risk so that residual risk associated with each hazard as well as overall risk is judged acceptable. And you have to make sure that you account for all known and foreseeable risks and minimize these. And this is a continuous process. With your post-market surveillance system, you feed back into your risk management. So you're updating it fairly often. And briefly on post-market surveillance, as I've mentioned it several times, You need to have a plan, and this needs to address or include a post-market clinical follow-up plan as well. Now, there are a lot of details set out in the MDR of what these are, and there are also several guidance documents available out there. Vigilance, which is very similar to what you would call MDR in the US, medical device reporting, so anything that happens. You also have to do trend reporting, but to do so, you have to determine what is going to be a trend and how you're going to report that and the justification behind it. Serious incidents and field safety corrective actions. Now, this might be a recall, for example, or a correction. You have to do a post-market surveillance report. That's for class 1, or if you have class 2A, 2B, and class 3, you have to do a periodic safety update report. And there are different frequencies required for these. And the data you gather has to be fed back into your clinical evaluation and other parts of the technical documentation, not least your risk management. And another question, poll for you. I'm getting some quick answers. Again, we have a clear trend. The correct answer, which 81% of you have selected, is process validation. So to finish up on a positive note then for regulatory requirements. If you've already been through an FDA process, don't underestimate your advantages associated with this. Most of the information you need for your technical documentation is probably going to be in place. Not all of it, but most of it. You've probably already complied with relevant international standards, for example, electrical safety or risk management or biocompatibility. So in most cases, you're not starting from scratch. You might need to do a gap analysis to identify any shortcomings in what you have, but at least you have a foundation. The good thing is that FDA requirements and guidance have often been ahead of the EU. For example, software lifecycle requirements from the FDA have been around longer than the 62304 standard in the EU. UDI requirements have been in place for some time in the US, and they're only now coming into effect in the EU. Cybersecurity is an area where the FDA is extremely active, and we're really seeing that the European Union is following closely on that. The notified bodies are going for the same things. Human factors is something that the FDA has considered also, way before the 62366 standard existed. And things like MRI safety, which are not clearly set out in the MDR, but tends to pop up when you look at notified bodies and what they require. And do not underestimate the fact that you've already been through tough scrutiny. You've been through a process where you've had to respond to questions, and people have already challenged your documentation. So you really have some advantages. And this is something that you may not realize, but a lot of companies in Europe are doing this for the first time. It may be the case that they had a lower classification before and never had to deal with a notified body, or it may be that their notified body was not very strict, but they've now been brought into line. And the requirements are entirely different, and they need to be starting from scratch, essentially. So if you have FDA clearance or approval, you're really in a good position at this point to tackle MDR. And I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Paige.
Thanks. Great presentation, Antonia. Very informative. And you gave me a great lead into mine to say that the FDA certainly is tough scrutiny in terms of, both your device and the QMS itself. So I'm going to walk through the QMS requirements. As Antonia alluded, there are really two parts to getting clearance in the EU for your devices. One part, obviously, is the device portion itself, but the other part is really the qualification of your QMS. So Article 10 of the MDR specifies that manufacturers of devices other than investigational devices shall establish, document, implement, maintain, keep up to date, and continually improve a quality management system, QMS, that shall ensure compliance with this regulation in the most effective manner and in a manner that is proportionate to the risk class and the type of the device. That's a pretty bold statement from the regulation, and a lot of different requirements around what your QMS is supposed to do. So what I've done is I've broken down each part of the MDR requirement for a quality management system in comparison to both the FDA requirements and the ISO 13485 requirements. And we'll talk a little bit after the comparison about ISO 13485. But I want to start by saying, again, that the system is a little different from the FDA system. So many of you that are already dealing with the FDA, you're familiar with the concept of an FDA inspection. Now, your notified body will come and do audits. They can do unannounced audits, but you really have a lot more time to prepare for this because you're choosing a notified body, and in some cases, you're scheduling your audit. And in some other cases, you know which areas will be audited. So while there are differences between the FDA requirements, the ISO 13485 requirements, and what the MDR requirements are, really, if you're already used to that sort of FDA inspection, you don't really ever know what they're going to look at, and you don't necessarily know when they're going to be showing up to do your inspection. You may find ISO 13485 certification a bit nicer than the FDA inspection process. So MDR Article 10 has several different requirements for the quality system. So we'll go through each of them and we'll talk about the sort of corresponding clauses in ISO 13485 and in the FDA CFR. So the first one is a broad requirement. It's a strategy for regulatory compliance, including compliance with conformity assessment procedures and management of modifications to the devices covered by the system. So this is really a general requirement, and you'll see in both the ISO and the FDA columns, we have sort of these general requirement clauses 411 and 820.5. And this is also related to design change control. So we have here both 739 from ISO and 82030, which is the overall design controls section of the FDA CFR. So not much difference from this standpoint. Essentially, they're saying that you need to be able to maintain the strategy for implementing your quality system. The next one is the GSPR requirement, which Antonia spoke quite a bit about. Now, this is one requirement in the MDR that really is broken up in several different places in both ISO 13485 and in CFR 820. And you'll see that I have a very long list of things that are generally considered to be related to the GSPRs. One of the biggest differences here, though, is how they're going to be presented. And in this case, the MDR is putting a very strong reliance and requirement on the GSPRs versus the FDA system, which has sort of scattered these requirements in several different parts of the regulation. For the most part, if you have already cleared your device in the FDA, you likely already have most of these things, but they're unlikely to be organized in the way that your notified body will expect. So from a transition standpoint, most of this work is going to be finding what you've already done and applying it to the correct part of GSPRs. Now, the next part is responsibility of the management. This one is very straightforward, and it's a requirement in both ISO and the CFR in Chapter 5 and ISO 13485, and of course, CFR 82020 in for the FDA. The next one being resource management, and this includes selection and control of, oh, what's happening? Oh, no. Oops, sorry about that. Not sure what happened there. So I was saying the next one is resource management, and this includes selection and control of suppliers and subcontractors. Now, as you can see from the ISO column and the FDA column, Again, this is one where the MDR has looped or has combined these things together in a way that ISO and FDA haven't. So from an ISO standpoint, we're looking at chapter 4.1.5, chapter 6, and a section in chapter 7.4 for purchasing. And similarly with the FDA, we're looking at 820.25, which is personnel, and 820.50, which is purchasing controls. Overall, the requirements for this are not that different. It's just, again, where the regulation is, and in your case, where it might already be structured in your QMS. Next, we have a specific call out for risk management, and the reference here is to another part of the regulation to essentially say you have to follow these requirements for risk management. From an ISO standpoint, again, we have two very different sections here. Same thing with FDA. From an FDA standpoint, they are not really calling out the requirement for risk management. And it is something that while the FDA has published quite a bit of guidance on it, there still really isn't a very clear spot in the CFR where they're telling you to have a risk management system. We'll talk more about this later too when we get to potential gaps and advantages. The next one is the requirement for a clinical evaluation according to Article 61. So for both ISO and FDA, this is not a stated requirement. Now, you could draw a connection between things that are in the FDA CFR and in ISO 1345 to say that they sort of come up in the clinical evaluation requirement, but it is very explicitly stated in the MDR requirements that you must have this and have a quality process for it. And this is not a requirement of either ISO 1345 or in the Code of Federal Regulations. The next requirement is product realization, and this includes planning, design, development, production, and service provision. So this is one that is mostly grouped together in ISO in Chapter 7, and I have the specific clauses listed there. And from a CFR standpoint, again, we have kind of bits and pieces all over that are related to this, primarily design controls, production and process controls, and of course, we have 820.200 for servicing. The next MDR requirement is related to verification of UDI assignments. And again, it is referencing another article within the MDR that you must comply with. ISO 1345 does not have any specific UDI requirements. However, FDA, as Antonia mentioned, has been doing quite a bit of UDI process work and requirements through the regulations. So this is an area where you may be able to leverage your FDA experience with UDI to meet this regulation. So the next one, again, is something that is more unique to the EU, which is the setup, implementation, and maintenance of a post-market surveillance system. So ISO does touch on this a bit with 821 and 851 feedback and improvement. And from an FDA standpoint, they do have requirements for complaint files, and they do have the requirement for analysis of quality data. However, there is not really a direct comparison for the post-market surveillance system. These are the post-market surveillance activities that the FDA is requiring, but it looks quite a bit different than what the EU is expecting. So the next one is handling communication with competent authorities, notified bodies. Obviously, this is very specific to the EU. Now, ISO does have 723 regarding communication. And same thing from an FDA standpoint, there are communication requirements in 82198 for complaint files. But again, this is very sort of specific to the EU in an area where you're going to expect to have to update your QMS to meet that. The next part is reporting of serious incidents and field safety corrective actions or recalls in the context of vigilance. Again, this is an area that's pretty well covered from both an ISO and an FDA standpoint. However, keep in mind that there are not only EU-specific requirements, but specific competent authorities may have requirements that you need to follow. So in this sense, we see, FDA obviously has a lot of specific US regulations for this that likely don't translate into some of the EU requirements. The next section is management of corrective and preventive actions, or CAPA. This is well documented in both ISO and FDA. And the last one is a process for monitoring and measurement of output, data analysis, and product improvement. And again, this is clearly stated in both ISO and FDA, and I have the regulations listed there. So we have another question here, which is, which of the following is not a requirement of ISO 13485? Okay, give everyone a couple more seconds to get their answers in. And we do seem to have a consensus with around 75% with the correct answer, which is clinical evaluation. So a reminder here that clinical evaluation is one of the MDR requirements that is neither specified in ISO nor in the FDA CFR requirements. This is likely an area of your QMS that if you've been only operating in the FDA, you really have a gap here from a QMS standpoint. So I mentioned before that we would talk about ISO 13485, and really the question is, why is this the standard that we're using, and is it really called out in the MDR? And the short answer is that MDR does not actually technically mandate that you use ISO 13485. However, it is the only harmonized standard that addresses QMS requirements. So there is a requirement to follow harmonized standards. There is a requirement to have a quality management system. Therefore, there is in practice a requirement to follow a harmonized standard for a quality management system, which in this case is ISO 13485. But beyond that, it is really the best way to ensure that your medical devices are developed and manufactured under controlled and reproducible conditions, which is the main concern. This is really at the heart of it, the reason why you would establish a quality management system at all, and why there are so many requirements around needing to have a quality management system throughout the world. So one other thing I'd like to touch on is the difference here between, from an FDA standpoint, what we know is the management representative, the ISO QMR, and the MDR PRRC. So the PRRC, which is the person responsible for regulatory compliance, as you can see, has very specific requirements per MDR. And I believe that's a typo because I think that should be Article 15. So the QMR in ISO, again, has broad requirements, and the most broad requirements are the FDA management representative. So there are really more specific requirements for the PRRC in terms of what they are responsible for, and what they are specifically stated to have certain educational and background requirements. Now, what many people end up doing is having their management rep and their QMR and their PRRC essentially be the same person. But again, consider that your PRRC does have additional responsibilities beyond what your management rep or your QMR is required to have. So there are definitely some potential gaps from a QMS standpoint if you are moving from the FDA system to the EU. One thing that you want to keep in mind that I mentioned earlier is that unlike with the FDA, your QMS does need to be certified by your notified body. So one of the advantages to the FDA, as I'm sure many of you know, is that once you release your device on the market, especially if you have a lower risk class 1 device, there is no necessarily certification process of your QMS by the FDA. They may not even come to inspect you right away. So you really have a period of time where you can release your device and be improving and implementing your QMS just by the fact that they are not going to show up on your door, unless of course you have a PMA. But if you have a class 1 or a class 2 device and you get clearance for it or you list it, you have not already gone through this exercise to have the FDA review your QMS. So this is, I think, one of the biggest gaps that we are experiencing moving from the FDA to the EU is just this understanding of how to work with the privatized notified body versus the expectations from the FDA. One other note here that the FDA requirements are not fully aligned with ISO and certainly not with MDR. So the idea that if you are already, active in the FDA and they've come and inspected you, or even if you have ISO certification already, those things don't necessarily translate directly into following all of the MDR requirements. So something to keep in mind when you're looking to move towards ISO 13485 certification is that you can't necessarily just move right from FDA QMS into the ISO certification. So again, Antonia mentioned most of these, but the areas of biggest difference include, of course, the clinical evaluation, which is not a requirement in the US, post-market surveillance, which looks quite a bit different from an FDA standpoint, risk management, and the biggest part, I think personally, is the records exception. So from an FDA standpoint, you know that currently they are not allowed to review your audit reports. They're not allowed to review your management review reports. This is an FDA and a US specific exception. So don't be alarmed when you're going through the process of transitioning to the EU when this starts to, they want to review those types of reports. So I believe this is our last question, and it is, what does PRRC stand for? Okay, we have 96% agreement on this one. Correct answer is C, person responsible for regulatory compliance. So again, to end here on a positive note, there are some advantages from a QMS standpoint. As I mentioned previously, many QMS elements are actually more stringent for the FDA. And so when you go to do your ISO 13485 certification, in some cases, you likely won't have to modify them at all, or they'll need very little modification. So good examples here are the CAPA system, process validation system is extremely similar. Purchasing controls and document controls, for the most part, are the same. And analysis and of data and statistical techniques translates quite well if you have a robust system into the trend reporting requirements of MDR. The next one, if you've already implemented ISO 14971 2019, this is the risk management process really that we're looking for in the EU. Now, not every US company has done this because, again, the requirements for risk management are not really in the regulation. They're sort of implied in a series of regulations. So if you've already done the exercise to use an ISO 14971 risk management system, you've already done most of the legwork from a QMS standpoint. And while, of course, there are some UDI differences between FDA and EU, you can leverage your existing UDI process. And I've found in my experience that it's much easier to go from FDA UDI understanding to EU than the other way around. So this is certainly an area where your FDA experience will help you. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Christy, and she's just going to walk through some next steps with Veranex.
Thank you so much. Maybe we could get someone on mute here. Wonderful. So, some questions that may come up from here, it's strategic questions as where should we go, regulatory pathway support, development plan, or project management. Also from a tactical perspective, how do we get there? So if you're in need of gap assessments, audits, training, ongoing coaching support, so we definitely offer that as a service. And then implementation, and this is something that our teams, globally are an excellent resource for, whether you're an early stage company and you don't have the resources to bring people on full time, or you're mid or late commercial stage company and your teams are overwhelmed with all of the other work that is needed. We come in, we support with implementation, technical documentation support, updates such as the work that's been shared with today. So we are happy to tailor and be an extension of your team wherever possible. So please reach out and we will follow up from this webinar with some of our contact information as well as the recording. But I do want to pause. We have 3 minutes left for our Q&A, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat. Okay, so question is how to leverage clinical data obtained in the US with an FDA approved product to support clinical evaluation in the EU.
So I can take that one very briefly. So any studies that you've done can certainly be part of the clinical evaluation. But as I very briefly mentioned, the clinical evaluation is quite a large and greatly encompassing process where you're looking at literature as well as your studies. So you need to look at those studies together with the literature, and you also need to make sure that the studies that you've done comply with European requirements. But you can certainly use the data you have as long as they are compliant with European requirements as well.
Thank you. Another question that I actually do get asked quite often from a business development perspective from potential clients looking to partner with us is, if we are in compliance with ISO 9001, can we say that we're ISO 13485 certified? So this is a great question. It comes up a lot.
I can take that one. So the idea between 9001 and 13485 is really that 13485 takes 9001 and builds on it for really for medical devices. So, you know, with any ISO standard, you can certainly say that you've fulfilled requirements of both of these. I would not say that if you have a certification for one, that it automatically means necessarily that you're certified for the other. But certainly most of, if not all of the 9001 requirements are sort of somewhere in 1345. Typically, though, 1345 has additional requirements, or the requirements are more stringent because it is specifically for medical devices.
Okay, another common question is, and maybe difficult to ask quickly or answer quickly, but which regulations apply to combination products?
I can take that one. And yes, it is difficult to answer quickly. The answer is essentially it depends. You need to get into the detail here because the broad brush answer is that the device part will need to comply with device requirements and the drug part will need to comply with drug requirements. But you really need to look at what the action of the medicinal substance is. If it's ancillary to the medical device, for example, if it's integrated, or if the medical device is administering the medical substance. So I cannot give a detailed answer without knowing a bit more about the device in question. And this is really something that you need to look at when you're doing your qualification in detail, having all the definitions at hand.
Unfortunately, Antonia, our answer often is the devil's in the details. So we're happy to take that, offline with any of you one-on-one. So we are unfortunately at time, and there are a couple more questions in the chat that I believe we can answer via email. But again, thank you so much to you both for the presentations and for all of our participants for joining.